Russia during the Tsars had one of the highest birth rates on Earth, with around 7 children per woman. By the end of the Soviet era, the average Soviet woman had 1.5 children, beneath replacement levels. The Soviet Union just made a hopeless society in which people wondered if there'd be any future for their children, and also I've heard that Soviet hospitals were so deeply unpleasant that many women didn't want to get pregnant just so they wouldn't have to enter them. This is why Russia has, for all intents and purposes, the same population as World War II, while the US's has more than doubled since then, and most developing countries have anywhere from 3 to 9 times the population. Russia in this timeline would have upwards of twice the population, likely nearing 400 million people. These people would in large part migrate into the east, into Siberia and Central Asia. Siberia has the reputation for being an uninhabitable wasteland. This is only partly true. Large sections of its southern reaches have a moderately temperate climate, at least by.
Okay, let me just say that he's assuming that a this ultranationalist, autocratic capitalist society would be more prosperous, but to be honest, I simply don't know if that's the case. So what needs to be said is that famines existed before communism and before Stalin. For example, check out the 1892 Great Famine in Russia that some historians argue greatly discredited the monarchistic regime and actually helped the communists later to get peasants on their side against the emperor. So we really can't just assume that Russian demography would be doing much better. Mm, on the one hand, it is possible. Yeah, it is possible. Some historians also argue that the fact that the abortion was legalized also led many in the Soviet Union to just have fewer children. So it is possible that a non-communist system probably uh, wouldn't have legalized abortion. That is true. But on the other hand, I think that it was the um, actually that it was very progressive of the Soviets to legalize abortion. So I'm really not sure what to think about this issue. And well, on the other hand, the main reason why Khrushchev legalized it after Stalin banned it is he realized that the number of illegal abortions is actually higher than what most people think. So he just said, well, what the hell? I mean, if people do it, then let's make it legal. That was essentially his argument. But yeah, I mean, I just want to say that uh, all of these factors, other than abortion, that led to demographic decline would probably exist in a ultranationalist capitalistic society like wars, famines, and other. But okay, let's hear this guy out.
By my Canadian standards, but there just aren't enough Russians to settle them in our world. In this timeline, we would see ethnic Russians settling in Siberia, expanding the Russian population enormously and founding new cities. Russians would become the ethnic majority in much of Central Asia, surpassing the native population in many regions. A comparison could be made to the enormous migration of Americans in the Rust Belt to the southern and western United States after World War II, making California and Texas more important states than Ohio and New York. The Soviets also killed off many of Russia's intellectuals. This is why Soviet art of all stripes sucks. If you were an intellectual, you would follow Stalin's wildly fluctuating dictates to the word, and if not, to the Gulag. This killed Russia's pre-existing large cultural influence. Soviet technology was held back by Stalin's bizarre predilections. For example, in biology, Stalin picked a bizarre theory put out by one of his favorites, and anyone who stood against it was considered a Western hack and sent to the Gulag. Soviet science was only able to flourish in incredibly abstract fields like physics. This would be different in this timeline, with Russia a much more powerful technological juggernaut. Also, my friend the Aral Sea needs a shout out here. The Aral Sea was a large inland sea in Central Asia that the Soviet Union destroyed in their desire to turn Central Asia into Russia's cotton belt. This worked, but it prevented any water from getting into the sea and thus drained it and destroyed the local ecosystem. As America's idiotic water policy in the West demonstrates, capitalist regimes can do equally stupid things. However, only communism's single-minded hatred of nature allowed this to happen. Democracies, with the public's emotions important and monarchies with their respect for tradition, would have applied brakes at some point to keep most of the Aral Sea intact. The Soviets get a lot of credit for industrializing Russia and quickly finishing the process the Tsars started. Like all communist states, the Soviets had a very strong focus on industrialization. However, the Soviet Union was able to industrialize by destroying everything else. They didn't build a natural and stable industrial economy. Instead, in a mad rush for heavy industry, they destroyed the entire society and economy. The quality of the goods involved was terrible, without any external judge or competition besides the state, and the demand was weak with a poor agricultural base to pull from. So, did the Soviets do anything good? A couple things, actually. Firstly, although this has been really overstated by the left, it was moderately better for women. Also, Russia before the Red seized power was moving in a very nationalistic direction, with the regime being taken over by Slavic nationalists. In this timeline, Russia, even if still a democracy, would be taken over by a deeply racist and nationalistic regime that would marginalize especially the Turkic peoples of Central Asia. Peoples like the Kazakhs, Uzbeks, and the like would be driven onto reservations while the best lands would be given to Slavs. Another really bad thing was that Tsarist Russia was very anti-Semitic, with pogroms picking up in its final years. This would get much worse as the Jews were a large proponent of the communist cause, and having the communists being so bloodthirsty during the Civil War would just inflame the anti-Semitism of the Russian nationalists. After the war, in an attempt to purify the Slavic nation, Russia would evict all its Jews. This was a pretty bad time for immigration, as Europe was deeply shell-shocked after the First World War and wasn't accepting immigrants, especially from disliked ethnic minorities. The US also closed its borders to immigration in 1921. Some would migrate to the Levant, but the British colonial overlords wouldn't allow more than would disturb the balance of power between Arabs and Jews, and thus make their job more difficult. The main countries that were accepting immigrants at this point were in South America, and so millions of Jews would migrate to Argentina and Brazil. With their mercantile skill set, the Jews would enrich the whole region, as has been the case with every country that has seen mass Jewish immigration. Rio de Janeiro and Buenos Aires would become significantly wealthier and culturally more active in this timeline. In summary, we would see a very different Russia develop. It would be a strong capitalist economy with a burgeoning population, albeit a quite racist and xenophobic society.
Okay, so let me just say that he acknowledges that perhaps all the Jews would have been ethnically cleansed or slaughtered in a purely ultra-nationalist Russian society, but that brings us to many other possible conclusions. Like, for example, the guy that invented the first nuclear weapon for the Soviets was actually Jewish, so maybe that guy wouldn't have existed. Maybe they just would have never developed nuclear weapons. I mean, I don't know, it is possible. Many other very educated and smart people that remained in the Soviet Union despite anti-Semitism that still existed, but existed to a lesser extent because leftists were in power. I mean, Stalin did have an anti-Semitic phase, but it was just a phase, not something that happened throughout the period of 30 years that he was in power. So, yeah, I think that it's reasonable to assume that anti-Semitism was actually lessened by the communists. And yeah, not to mention that if you base your entire society on ultranationalism, if that's your main ideology, like it was in Imperial Russia, well, then that kind of ideology simply has to alienate all the other nations, like the Ukrainians, Bashkirs, Chechens, and that causes instability. Yeah, so maybe that instability would lead to additional wars of secession and economic crisis. It's possible, but this guy doesn't mention that possibility in this video.
With a colonial constitutional monarchy, Russia would fit in with the civilized states of the 1920s quite well. Instead of becoming a pariah state, Russia would remain a part of the world community. Russia would trade ideas and goods with the West, with Russian grain supporting much of Europe. Germany's greatest fear has always been being overrun by Slavic hordes from the east. It was bad enough when they were both Christian, but when the Slavic hordes became part of an ideology that literally espoused the destruction of Western civilization and private property, it just made the danger that much worse. The Nazi idea of an enormous international Judeo-Marxist conspiracy was given credence by there actually being an international communist conspiracy to destroy the Germany they knew. With a much more reasonable threat, this time's version of the Nazis would be much more reasonable. There would still likely be a fascist movement in Germany due to the defeat in World War I, but would likely be more along the lines of Franco or Mussolini's movements, not advocating genocide or the like, merely wanting a return of Germany's honor and empire. World War II would likely still happen, with the seeds for it planted in the First World War, and with long-term geographic reasons also sparking it. The war would likely still follow a similar outline, with Germany getting involved in a two-front war with Russia and the Western powers due to Germany's geographic position. Russia would still likely win the war. Russia might be slightly less industrialized, so it would have other advantages that work in its favor that would balance it out. Stalin killed 80% of the high-level Russian officers in 1938, and thus Russian leadership in the early stages of the war was abysmal. Soviet military doctrine, due to Stalin's obsession with control, was quite inefficient and hierarchical, and thus resulting in unnecessary loss and waste. The Soviets were so awful to the Ukrainians that many actually supported the Germans in the early stages of the war as well. It's impossible to know the exact details of this war, when Russia would get involved, when it would end, but a similar rough outline to our timeline seems reasonable. We would likely end up seeing Russia and the US divide up the European continent. The Russians would support conservative monarchies in each country, placing a relative of the Kaiser in charge of East Germany and similar regimes in Poland, Hungary, and the like. During the fall of the Japanese Empire in 1945, we would likely still see the Russians attack Manchuria and give it to an allied power. In this timeline, there would be a monarchist faction rather than the communists. This could end in several different ways. Firstly, we could see China divided between a monarchist north and a nationalist south, or with the nationalists taking over the whole thing. There wasn't a strong monarchist movement among the majority Han Chinese, since the last monarchs were the barbarian foreign Manchus, and so it seems unlikely that the monarchists would take over the Han heartland of China. However, it is possible that the American-supported nationalists would have crushed the Russian-supported monarchists and united China. In either way, China would be in much better shape. I once read a book that said that Mao, by grace of dying, was the most important thing in the history of reducing poverty. China, after changing to a capitalist system, was able to become a world economy and power. With the nationalists or monarchists in charge, this would have happened decades earlier. Similarly, without Russian support, countless other communist regimes around the world would have never come to be. African warlords in need of weapons would have appealed to whatever cause the Russians or Americans would want. Latin Americans wanting to distance themselves from the United States and their ruling landlords would appeal to ethnic nationalism rather than communism. Truth be told, communism was the best thing that ever happened to
And because of it, and because African countries would not have Marxist ideology on their side, they would probably lose in this scenario Russia as an ally, because these guys forgetting that anti-colonialism and anti-racism were found in original Marxism. They were part of the original doctrine. It wasn't just something that the Soviets started doing in order to weaken the capitalist states, which is why communism was actually so successful at spreading to many colonial and post-colonial countries like Vietnam, Korea, Ethiopia, that was never colonized but was conquered by the fascists. And without this Marxist utopia, without this vision of a Marxist utopia that's anti-racist and anti-colonialist, I don't think that an alternative Russian state would have so much influence in the world. I mean, Russian nationalism is just not that appealing to African countries like communism was. That's just a fact, and even Putin and Dugin acknowledge it actually, and they realize that their new ideology, because it is ultra nationalistic, actually cannot bring them so many allies like communism could, which is why Dugin actually tried to establish this crazy thing that he calls a fourth political ideology. But to me, I actually read his book, and to me, it's essentially fascism, but he just calls it something different. But okay, let's continue with this video.
the US. It retarded or destroyed the development of the countries that would be its greatest natural competitors due to their size, Russia and China. Without the inefficiencies of communism, it seems likely that the Eastern Bloc would have collapsed. With all the resources and space combined with enormous cultural and soft power, Russia would be very dangerous indeed. In fact, considering the resource to population ratio, if the Russian system was even halfway honest, they would be one of the richest countries on Earth. That would be quite an attractive alternative to the United States. Meanwhile, China, with a 30-year head start, would be an established power, strong enough that it wouldn't need a sponsor, instead would have an extensive ally network. The world would be a three-way power struggle between Americans, Russians, and Chinese. An important question that I really don't have a good answer for is, would there be a major war as America and Russia would have to adapt to China rising as a great power, possibly more powerful than either of them? And I don't know, partially because this alternate history has been so long already, and there are so many confounding variables, but also we don't know how the world will react to the rise of China in our world, let alone this alternate history. Whatifalthist, and thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please comment, subscribe, like, or tell a friend. Also, if you want to see more of my maps never before seen in Whatifalthist, head on to my Patreon, the link to which is in the description.
So okay, what I want to say, like, this video isn't bad, but it just ignores some pretty important things, like just what I mentioned, like the fact that communism was very appealing to an average guy, especially in countries with great wealth inequality, which is why it easily spread to Vietnam, Korea for a while, to Afghanistan. In Indonesia, it was very popular before the communists got slaughtered by the military and the gangsters. So yeah, not to mention that because of that popularity, Russia had well, when I say Russia, I mean the Soviets had a very successful spy network that helped them at many times during the World War II and after that war. And I don't know if they would have the same type of spy network in this alternative history scenario. But yeah, I just wanted to mention all these things since this guy didn't mention them. But all in all, it was a good video, but it was flawed. It was definitely a very flawed video.